All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second Faura webinar. Thank you, first off, for joining us on your morning, lunch period, afternoon, evening, wherever you might be. We appreciate all of you and appreciate your attention to this topic as a whole. Wildfire is very near and dear to us here at Faura. We got our start in wildfire and have been working with people in firewise councils, fire safe organizations, grant funds, government agencies, and now insurance companies to close the gap for policyholders. So again, I mentioned this in the beginning, but the session will be recorded and we will send a link to all the participants and everyone on the list after the call. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or leave them to the end. Yeah, just in case there's anything that comes up. And with that being said, and I wanted to introduce my co-founder, Amanda. She's on the call. She will be answering questions kind of in the chat if you have any throughout the presentation. So yeah, without further ado, for a little bit of context, I am the CEO and co-founder at Faura. We essentially create loss control solutions for insurance companies with high-risk books of business. So typically in wildfire-prone areas, hurricane, flood, hail, you name it, anywhere where there's high natural disaster risk, that's where we are to help with risk validation and mitigation. So now to get into it, did you know that 2 in 5 people in the US will be impacted by a natural disaster in the next 3 years? That's practically half of the people in this room, 40%. And if not in this room, it's family, friends, and neighbors that will be hit by something like a wildfire, hurricane, hail, tornadoes, flooding. We all know this is serious, and you know it is because you wouldn't be sitting here listening to me speak. So before we dive in to all the details, I wanted to place this thought in your head, this question of how can we use what's right in front of us? This is the question we thought of a lot when we were building Faura the most, and I'll explain why in just a second. But take a second to just think about within your organizations and communities where this fits into your positions and how this applies to you in the fight against wildfire. A lot of the time, it feels pretty hopeless for us and everyone around us. How do we stop these massive fires and disaster events when we don't even fully understand them? But that's what we're going to be getting into later in this chat. So here's the agenda. First, we're going to touch on a few general trends in the industry and why they are important. I think it's important to set the stage here before we get into all the nitty-gritty details. The next thing we're going to be talking about is the top 3 areas to look out for within policyholders. So kind of insights that we like to look for when targeting solutions that deal with the policyholder or provide the policyholder value, and what that means for the rest of the industry and what your roles are kind of looking for. Then we're going to touch on wildfire risk factors and specific action items that you can take in to help not only inform policyholders, but also inform how you perform a lot of that risk selection. And then we'll close off with some statements at the end. So it's no secret the world is getting hotter, with 3 million people having lost their homes in the last 3 years. The number of billion-dollar disasters is skyrocketing. And now, again, 2 in 5 Americans are going to be impacted by a natural disaster this year, with a record number of premiums also skyrocketing. The majority of people know this on the call coming from the insurance industry, but it's important to kind of set that for the people that might not be in that area. This is a graph of the billion-dollar disasters that are happening and have been happening quite frequently. Last year, we hit a record number of $28 billion disasters. And that's not just wildfire, that's all the different natural disasters combined. But this paints a really interesting picture in how we're understanding the kinds of wildfires and hurricanes and massive events and how they are impacting our economy, our insurance industry, and how people look at a lot of these disasters and what they do. So let me ask you a question. What do State Farm, Farmers, Allstate, and Chubb all have in common? These insurance companies account for nearly 50% of all the home insurance policies in California, and all of them have started either canceling or non-renewing their books. When we think back to that 2 in 5 number, that means that around 40% of the people being impacted by a disaster, at least half of them, or likely a greater percentage because they're being canceled by that risk, are going to have trouble qualifying for insurance. And this is pretty terrifying. The vast majority of Americans today, our homes are our most valuable assets. they are, at the end of the day, the largest investment we will probably ever make. So you need insurance to have a mortgage, and you need a mortgage to have a home. So as people continue moving into these higher risk areas, this shocking reality turns into, a pretty, it starts to unfold. It really has for over 84 million Americans in the US. And those of you who rent, it's still a crazy big deal. We seem to forget about renters insurance sometimes. But it's this idea that, your rent is going to go up an insane amount if your landlord can't get insurance. So there's this general trend that we're painting here that insurance companies are pulling out of states because of the disaster risk. Homeowners and people are understanding that natural disasters are a big risk. And you would think that this trend has homeowners choosing to move somewhere else, maybe further from the coast or avoiding woodlands. But actually, climate change really hasn't been a deterrent at all. According to Redfin, people actually gravitate towards these areas because of a couple different things. The first one, affordable housing prices. A lot of these areas haven't truly been impacted by the cloud of insurance and property that is rising now with natural disasters. Then lower property taxes, and then general proximity to nature. It seems like the actual only natural phenomenon that is actually changing people's minds are floods in the Midwest and areas prone to heat stroke, which, as a person born and raised in Vegas, I can definitely understand why people would not want to move there. So we have this big problem, which probably means that we need this big solution, right? Like we need something that's extremely complex. But in fact, it's fairly simple. And it all starts with the policyholder. How can we use what's right in front of us? Again, that question of something that we're trying to bring to our organizations. Now, before we get into the wildfire specifics, we need to emphasize the importance of education at the policyholder level. That's the first step. This is the thing that improves retention, creates new business opportunities, and reduces our loss ratios at the end of the day. When homeowners have enough knowledge and more resources, it opens up the floodgates to a lot of different things, namely a lot of questions and concerns, but it's also important that these resources are timely, supported, and help streamline decision-making. For example, look at all of these resources. These are pulled from a few different insurance companies' websites. And yes, there are decent articles and there's nuggets of information here and there, but there's nothing in here that actually describes what benefits you get from reducing your risk, like where to get products or services to complete them, how much it costs, etc. These are pieces of educational content, but it's hardly a good resource that gives homeowners a reason to trust their insurer. We'll touch on action items and the overall process the homeowners go through later, but the real emphasis that I want to lean in here is on the personalized nature of education. We want to feel like the products that we use and the companies that we interact with actually care about us. In fact, you probably wouldn't want to be with anyone that doesn't care about you. And a part of making policyholders feel and trust their provider is with this personalized education piece. We just happen to do this through self-inspections and action items at Faura, but this can be anything from direct conversation with policyholders to community relief where you can answer questions and point people in the right direction to localized agencies and simply having a good agency network. Education at the end of the day is all about trust. When we have trust, we learn a lot more and we want to be guided along the way. Right now, as most of you know, trust is dwindling quite a bit. And a lot of that is because policyholders a lot of the time are being left in the dust. And we're not necessarily blaming carriers at all here because this is a very new thing for all of us. We haven't really had to educate and personalize and really change a lot of the things about the way that we've done a lot of this risk identification for multiple decades. But needless to say, we've got some catching up to do. So when we started Faura, we also noticed a big disconnect between homeowners and insurance companies in their communication. So this is separate from education in the way that we're essentially delivering that education. So for example, we have Paul. Paul lost his insurance policy recently in the last month or so. This is a real person, although it does look AI generated. He is a real guy that I talked to on a frequent basis. And so he lost his insurance policy on his home because of an unauthorized drone flyby of his property. For context, Paul runs the Napa Firewise Council. He's retrofitted his home against wildfire in every single way, and we'll touch on those ways later. And he's never been touched by a wildfire, let alone filed a claim about it. But when he tried to get in touch with this company, they didn't have a solid way to connect him with the right people he needed to talk to. He waited on the phone for hours, got an email with no actionable feedback, and at the end of the day was left without insurance or answers as to where he should go next. This is why the first step to protecting our policyholders is communication, and not only to keep them under our wing, but to encourage them to reduce their risk and stay safe in trying times. Some companies have already installed, like weather alerts on properties, automatic sprinkler systems. I know there's a couple companies that have their own private firefighting fleets, but nothing beats clean contact and resources to help policyholders make their own decisions and get rewarded. And so in running Faura, this pattern emerges. So let's take this solar panel phenomenon, for instance. 20% of people are buying solar panels because they're more energy efficient, and they would do so without any benefit or tangible value that's added to them. So they're just the kinds of people that want to be more energy efficient. They're the kinds of people that want to be more environmentally friendly, and they would do it regardless of who was telling them they should or shouldn't. But what about that other 80%? We can rely on around 20% of people to buy solar panels, but the overwhelming majority of people are buying solar panels, the 70 to 80%, because they see that direct translation in their energy bill. This is exactly what we're talking about when we think about how to incentivize people to do risk reduction. So, for example, we can rely on 20% of people now to reduce the risk on their property naturally, simply because either they want to protect their family or their valuable asset, or they want to just be the kind of person that does wildfire mitigation and go out of their way to carve that path for themselves. But what about the 80%, right? Like how are we incentivizing that other piece of the population that is struggling to get insurance, that doesn't know where to turn, that doesn't either have the resources or have the time to carve out that path for themselves? How are we targeting that 80%? So what is working here that we can replicate is this idea: how can we use what's right in front of us, the rewards and value that homeowners get in return? And when we think about solar panels, they aren't even that important to the overall efficiency of a home. If someone took away your ability to have solar panels, it's not the end of the world. But if someone took away your ability to have home insurance, we have a completely different problem on our hands. So this is kind of the idea that we want to go into in terms of returning tangible value. It's more generally that we get this idea of returning tangible value because when you think about it, home insurance really hasn't needed to change at all in the last 100 years or so. And why is that? Because there simply hasn't needed to be enough variability. You see, insurance has changed a lot in the last 100 years, and it's had to in order to keep up with our changing world. So now we have devices and apps that we stick in our cars to price premiums based on how safe we drive. This whole telematics industry has really exploded. And of course, health and life has always been priced on how healthy we are, whether we're a smoker, exercising, things like that, and various health factors. So our reality has become a lot more complex, which means insurance companies have needed to get a lot more personalized in order to charge appropriately. But again, notice that I didn't mention anything about property here because properties don't change very much year over year, except the rogue camera installation or sprinkler or alarm system here and there. And so it's this idea that there hasn't been a variable that you could track besides roof age that's really changed your premium by all that much, because personalizing home insurance really didn't make sense until now. So climate risk is this new hyper-personalized variable that insurance companies are trying to get a handle of, introducing this new level of value and stress to the word insurance. So this begs the question: how do we reduce stress and add value? In the past, it's been about how we can increase our data modeling capacity and increase our underwriting efficiency. And while that is important and it's something that the entirety of the industry relies on, this conversation has shifted to something a bit more abstract. It's this idea of the insurability crisis. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this or have been impacted by this or work in this industry, and companies haven't had to really worry about availability and really affordability as much as they've had to right now, which is another variable that carriers are trying to get a grip on. So how do we add value to a commodity that's slowly drifting away pretty far from reach? By injecting it at every exchange of the pipeline. So policyholders are already learning way more than they'd like to about insurance because they have to. They need to be able to understand what a deductible is, understand which policies are coming from where, and how much coverage that's going to get them, instead of just kind of the blanket, okay, I have home insurance, I'm good, I'm protected, I don't have to worry anymore. And so we have to make things easy for them. For example, when you ask a policyholder to complete an inspection survey or some kind of digital assessment, or maybe answer a couple more questions through a longer quote process, you're asking them to complete a completely new step that a competitor might not ask for. So because you're creating that uneven exchange and potentially a worse and more convoluted experience, you have to make it worth their time. If I'm a homeowner, I want to get some value out of whatever communication I'm getting with my carrier. And that's exactly why communication is as important as it is in the first place, because I'm trying to get some value out of talking to someone that is going to answer all of my questions. So for example, Faura uses action items and discounts to create a more even exchange. So we give you personalized feedback to qualify for more affordable insurance, and your insurance company gets valuable data that helps you qualify in the future and better understand your risk. But instead of just closing an app or tab that had you walk through your property with no next steps, you get something in return. This is exactly what we saw in the nonprofit sector in terms of, understanding how people are approaching their properties, where people are getting their information. And we realized that the disconnect was they kind of just stop. If you don't have a streamlined process, they kind of just fall off and don't engage. And this is incredibly important, more than you know, in all of the steps in this process. This is why insurance companies will spend $1 to acquire someone and $1.25 to continue to keep them on their books instead of actually making a profit from the origination of that client. So that's why when you ask companies, when companies ask you to fill out a survey for a quote, they email right away or send you a discount code. You feel like you're getting something in return for being a good person and filling out the instructions like they asked you to. And so this last general tip that we wanted to touch on for policyholders is this idea that policyholders inherently are the value. Now, a big component of why insurance companies are suffering right now is this fact that because property hasn't needed to innovate or change much in the last 100 years, neither have a lot of our models. So companies price policies based on zone. So an entire area can be classified as uninsurable due to extreme nature of risk without looking at individual parcels. Now, this is a much bigger problem that we can get into at a later webinar at a later date. But the real kicker here is that we're using 20 years of outdated modeling to formulate these zones, making it harder and harder for us to really know who is high risk and who isn't. Now, obviously, there's a couple ways insurance companies try to validate individual properties in these riskier areas. The most common is probably just sending a third-party inspector to actually physically visit the property. The cons of this are relatively obvious. It's relatively expensive, it's time-consuming, and in a lot of cases, the data isn't standardized so that you can actually use that information. So the inspections that are happening are pretty much a checkbox, a checklist that make sure that the policy has been properly represented, and then there's nothing else that you can extrapolate from that. And the other one that's probably something that a lot of us use in the industry is satellite or aerial imaging, in some cases drone flybys in the case of Paul. And so there's a lot you can get from an image like this. You can get if there's a pool in the backyard, if there's general vegetation, what the general roof looks like, and how we can use that to inform risk validation. But we start to think about the information that we're missing. And again, insurance companies don't really know what's going on at the parcel level when it comes to these models that we're using. But you know who does? Paul. Policyholders are the key to more advanced and standardized data collection, better risk management, and overall more affordable and available insurance products across high-risk areas. For example, these two homes would be flagged under the same level of risk. But according to the study done by IBHS, and with the scoring that we can provide and other people can provide, it's not even just us, we see that one home is far better off than the other. And this has been demonstrated time and time again. There's things in these homes, again, that we'll talk about in a second, like the vegetation near the property, the type of siding on the property, ventilation, fencing, roof material, gutters, all these different things that, again, really contribute to the overall survivability of a property. And again, with the Lahaina fire, there's even vegetation that still exists on this property where all of the rest have been essentially decimated, this entire neighborhood leveled to the ground. But this property, if in case you don't know, this is a famous picture from the Lahaina wildfire last summer in Hawaii. And this home was retrofitted for termites. So it was essentially very masonry heavy, lots of concrete, lots of barrier from vegetation and things that might house insects. And they survived because of that, because they unintentionally had defensible space. And this is really what we're focusing on, is just idea that this works and it's proven time and time again. So now utilizing policyholders does a couple different things. First, it gives us better data to give to underwriters to validate risk. And the second, it gives homeowners this chance to reduce the risk on their property and get rewarded. Insurance companies right now are leaving billions of dollars on the table because they don't fully understand their risk. And by allowing policyholders to make changes that lower their risk, increasing that communication, and honestly providing a lot of the education that they're missing, we're ultimately lowering not just their risk, but lowering everyone's risk. Something that we talk about a lot at Faura is this idea that the buildings of today cannot withstand the disasters of tomorrow. But again, with more education for both parties and more alignment of incentives, we can better align everyone and help everyone work together. So with that being said, let's get into some of the more potent risk factors of wildfire and what we can derive from them to better assist us this season. So at Faura, we perform risk assessments all throughout a policyholder smart device. And in doing so, we've nailed down not only what homeowners are most likely to do, but which action items have the highest probability of saving a home of saving a home according to NFPA standards. So we'll be sure to send a follow-up email with this recording again in case you'd like to reference any of the material. So we typically separate the property into 4 different categories, and this is how we're going to be dividing up the top action items for every structure. So while a lot of these tips have to do with your average home, these sub-items can be applied to a multitude of other commercial properties. So this is kind of touching on the roof, siding, foundation, and vegetation. We have another saying at Faura, and it's this: it's not about which properties are going to be hit by a natural disaster, it's about which properties are going to survive. So by focusing on the resilience of the structure and less on whether a wildfire is going to be present necessarily, we get a more granular view and are able to add more value. So if we break down every property into these 4 different areas of concern, let's kind of go backwards. So first we have the roof. In insurance and construction, the roof is one of, if not the most important characteristic of a property. It protects you from pretty much everything that pummels your assets, from rain to winds to hail and fire. And if your roof isn't intact, you're essentially living in Times Square. It's loud, cold, or sweaty depending on the year, and it's pretty unpredictable. So next we have the siding. That's walls and anything that lives within them. So this means any doors, windows, electrical panels, ventilation, and appliances that connect to the home, each with their own level of risk associated with the greater property. Each disaster has its own criteria for these characteristics of the home, but it's largely recommended that for the majority of wind-related or wildfire-related circumstances, that every piece of the siding you can kind of think of as being reinforced, double-paned, and sealed. Those are the biggest things that you want to be looking out for when you're assessing the siding of a property. Next, we have the foundation. The foundation is right on par with the roof's importance in a lot of cases, as it gets impacted by the entire weight of everything else on the property and leads a lot to those little nitty-gritty details in the home that you probably wouldn't see, like in the base of the home, little cracks in the foundation that embers can get into, flooding, heavy rainfall, earthquakes, all major disasters that, if they were to occur, would sink at least 1/3 of the US as of right now. And then we have vegetation. So this is a big one, obviously, with wildfire. It's pretty easy to tell why that is the case, but for the majority of natural disasters, vegetation also plays a pretty key role. So this is something we initially only looked at because of wildfire, admittedly, because that was the thing we knew the most about and it made sense. More vegetation, drier climate, the house is going to burn. But if we look closer, we realize that it plays much more of a role in the house's survivability of other disasters. For example, overhanging vegetation is bad for the home in pretty much every case with natural disasters, not just in wildfire. For wildfire, it's if embers get tossed into a tree from a neighboring fire, those have the tendency to trickle down from branches and fall onto the roof, igniting what we know is the most important element of the home. Now, that seems relatively self-explanatory, but branches and vegetative debris also have weight, and a lot of it. So if you have overhanging branches in a hurricane or wind-prone area, the excess weight on your roof from the buildup of twigs and small plant matter could actually put enough weight on your roof to damage it structurally. So there's a lot of different things that we can touch on from other natural disasters. We'll keep it pretty tight on wildfire, but it's important to note that a lot of these characteristics have ties in with other areas of survivability within the whole climate sphere. So we measured these characteristics all around, and we're going to get into each one individually and break down the most effective action items for each category. And the last thing that we should touch on here before we get into that is essentially this idea of defensible space. For those of you who don't know, defensible space is an area around a property or parcel that's been retrofitted for wildfire protection. So it could be something as simple as trimming your lawn or going further into removing entire trees. And it could be something like home hardening, which as you get into further zones, this work turns into more advanced products depending on how big the property is. But typically the zones go from 0 to 5 feet, 5 to 30, 30 to 100, and then everything over 100 feet. And with home hardening, which is essentially reinforcing your home to withstand a wildfire, it's not necessarily the vegetation or anything else around it. It tends to rely on the material, condition of the material, building codes, ember resistance, and anything else under that umbrella that protects the actual structure. So less about the overarching range of that's radiating out from the property. So with that being said, we have a couple different areas to cover along these lines. So when we think about the roof, that's where we're going to be kind of focusing on first. There's a couple different characteristics here that we want to touch on. So the first thing is your gutters. Gutters are something that I never thought about. My parents never thought about. No one ever thought about it in my life, except when I went into insurance and wildfire and realized that they are a big structural mess when it comes to wildfire resistance. And because they're so forgettable, they build up a lot of material, and we kind of let their condition go to the wayside whenever we're in a high risk area. So the first thing is making sure that your policyholders, or being able to tell that your policyholders have gutters made of some kind of metallic material. Typically, we recommend aluminum, copper, or steel, and we want to make sure that any vinyl siding on gutter materials is removed from them. Vinyl siding is extremely flammable, so installing those gutter guards and replacing regular gutter guards with metal materials is a really crucial risk factor that we've shown to be very, very beneficial for wildfire prevention. The other thing I touched on briefly here was because people don't really think about their gutters, they can fill up with a lot of vegetation really fast. And so it's important to know that with vegetation that's happening on the property, any vegetation in any little kind of like areas of the home have the ability to spark, especially if it's dead vegetation. So if there's overhanging vegetation, if there's overhanging like leaves, branches, whatever it might be, or anything in those gutters, make sure that that's a risk factor that you're flagging on your validation journey to essentially understand how likely that home is to burn. Next thing is, again, something that a lot of people are measuring. So whether the roof is made of fire resistant materials. The roof, again, is the largest continuous surface of the home. So protecting it from wildfire is extremely important. We recommend metal, tile, or some kind of fire resistant synthetic roofing that's best for facing wildfire season. And within those areas, there's a bunch of different categories of roofing that we'll provide some kind of like a list after this call for. But essentially, we want to educate this policyholder about fire ratings of different roofing materials and how that plays into their survivability. So for example, if we're using Class A shingles or fiberglass shingles, they're going to be much better than your traditional kind of vinyl or, God forbid, like roof, like wooden roof, siding. So ensure that that installation includes closed eaves. That means essentially that no embers or any material can get in through the roof. And any homes with wood or asphalt roofs can also be mitigated by flame retardant. Although obviously replacing the entire material is preferable. And then one of the final kind of like key characteristics of the roof is, again, that debris and overhanging vegetation piece. This is something that, again, we really want to make sure that we're honing in on and really emphasizing, just because this is something that a lot of people don't really think about too hard. And if they do, it's not a crazy thing that insurance companies really look for in a lot of cases. So when we think about overhanging debris, branches, vegetation, things like that, you really want to make sure that you're clearing branches at least 10 feet away from your chimney and removing debris that can clutter in your eaves, gutters, and other areas along the roof. One of the biggest things that I learned when I was initially getting into wildfire was the chimney and ventilation on the home. Ventilation we'll touch on in a little bit, but embers can travel for miles. So you can be in a non-wildfire zone and be impacted by a wildfire that's multiple miles away. In some cases, smoke can reach hundreds of miles. We saw that last summer with the Canadian wildfires on the East Coast. And in that case, embers can fly into your roof, can fly into your chimney, and burn your house from the inside out. And so if it gets in your chimney, if it gets in your vents or other openings that aren't protected, that's really where you're going to see a lot of ignition points. And it's very important to keep those clear. So another thing that we recommend for chimneys and other ventilation is putting an ember resistant grate over the chimney. These are super cheap. It's like 20 to 30 bucks on Amazon, and they just go in the little slot of your vent or chimney and keeps a lot of smaller embers from getting inside the property. And so that's kind of what we touched on with the roof. Those are the most potent risk factors. Another thing to touch on, now moving into vegetation, is dead and dying vegetation near that 0 to 5 foot area of defensible space. This, in general, acts as fuel for fires. That's point blank period. Dead and dying vegetation is more likely to ignite due to it being dead due to that lack of water. So clearing any dying vegetation within 5 feet of your home, like shrubs, trees, and other plant matter, is going to be really crucial in protecting your property. Another thing that we want to touch on is general ground cover. So this is different than dead vegetation. This is actual plant matter that could be alive, but could be completely, unruly. More plant matter the more plant matter you have on your property, the more fuel there is for a fire in the majority of cases. Something that a lot of people will touch on in rain seasons or heavy rainfall will say, okay, we got a lot of rain this season. Wildfires are going to be way less frequent because we had so much rain, everything is wet, everything's growing, whatever. But because things are growing, it leaves a lot more time for plants to become dead and for plants to build up fuel. And so in a lot of rain seasons, it actually means that the wildfire season will be worse. So being able to manage the vegetation around your property, so clearing yard debris and any litter that has built up from these plants, having 6 to 12 inches of separation from bushes and shrubs on the property, especially in that 0 to 5 foot debris area, and then any ground cover that couldn't be easily taken care of. That's something that we recommend removing or, again, spacing out along that 0 to 5 foot area of the property. And then in terms of debris on and around the home, we touched on this already a little bit, but kind of tearing over in vegetation. This is anything like dead leaves, pine cones, and other organic material. This doesn't even have to be specifically in your gutters. This could be under your decks. This is under the decks we're going to talk about in a little bit more specifically, but with an emphasis on the roof and the undersides of your property as well as your gutters, removing debris is quite literally one of the cheapest and easiest ways that a homeowner can protect their property. All right, and then our last kind of touch on vegetation is general vegetation management. Homes that put more effort into vegetation management will see more protection. That is just a fact of the matter. And in a lot of cases, if you're putting more effort into management, that's also encouraging other neighbors and people in your area to invest in vegetation management. That's why Firewise councils exist. That's why grant organizations invest in mitigation for entire communities and entire properties. It's simply because the more treatment that we do in a specific area with more people involved, the better it is for everyone and the more it reduces risk for everyone. So branches should be cut if they're less than 6 feet from the ground to reduce the chances of ignition. There's a lot of fires that can essentially crawl up a tree if there's branches that are readily at the ground. Ground plants shouldn't be taller than 4 inches to limit fuel. This is something that you can kind of see from general pictures and videos of the property. Essentially, if it's unruly, cut it. And then trees that could be placed, if you're planting trees, if you're in new construction, if you're in more commercial properties. In some cases, we've dealt with wineries before. So if there's wineries with large forests on the property that haven't been cleared, they should ideally be placed in a diamond pattern or chopped down in that diamond pattern to reduce the spread of that fire to other adjacent trees. So yeah, this is kind of what we recommend for vegetation. And then let's go into more of the siding of the home. So ignition resistant siding is relatively important and kind of falls into a lot of different categories here. But it is, again, the other major protector of the home. So we recommend that siding should be metal, concrete, stucco, or some kind of synthetic non-flammable material. Wooden and vinyl siding, again, is the worst for ignition resistant kind of structures. They literally basically like curl up and allow the fire to get into the inside pretty easily. So replacing any of that siding with metal or non-combustible materials is what we recommend. In terms of other benefits to the policyholder, it just improves the actual longevity of the building. Again, we touched on a little bit just the fact that buildings of today are not fit to withstand these wildfires and these floods and hurricanes that are impacting the property market. And so if we fit our homes with materials that are in general going to be a lot more efficient at withstanding disasters for the long run and not just in preventing them for one season, or we mentioned flame retardant before, but that's something that you have to continuously maintain and loses the effectiveness over a long time. So if we're improving the longevity of the building, we're ultimately going to be rewarded with less water damage, more resilience, and a better home for the majority of people that are living there. Next, we touched on this again. It's just like ember resistant screening on ventilation and chimneys. These stop embers and firebrands from entering the home. And this is especially true with a lot of these areas that have high winds. So any embers that can travel in these higher wind areas that also have high wildfire risk, it's really important to have non-combustible, typically 1/8 screening mesh. If you can get smaller than that, I don't even know if they actually make things smaller than that, but the smallest that you can get on exterior ventilation is going to be a really, really smart decision. We've had homes that we've seen that are basically just have the chimney standing and the rest of the house has been burnt from the inside out and there's nothing left. So putting an emphasis on this with policyholders, especially because it's a relatively low cost and low effort action item, is going to be really crucial. And then again, going back to that double paned, sealed, reinforced mindset on the siding of the home, fire ready windows are extremely helpful and beneficial. So this can be windows that are double paned, triple paned. Either way, traditional windows are going to shatter at a high heat. And any windows that haven't been properly sealed are going to allow things like embers to creep inside the foundation of the property and again, burn it from the inside out. So aim for triple paned. If you have heat resistant windows, that's also great. But windows with a low E coating can also reflect heat at a cheaper cost. So look for that marker on the products that you're buying or that you're recommending your policyholders to buy. So again, this goes back to better windows, better energy efficiency, lower bill for the homeowner. You're increasing your policyholder retention because you're getting them more rewards, you're getting them more tangible benefit. So replacing these windows have a lot more than just wildfire risk in mind. And especially because replacing windows can be a little bit more expensive, you want to be able to illustrate how much the homeowner will be benefiting from this, especially in times like this where we're basically prepping for a pretty heavy wildfire season as we speak. And then going back to decks. So decks are something that a lot of people, again, forget about because if there's material under your deck, you're not really thinking about what's under your deck unless you're storing things down there. And even then, you kind of put stuff down there that you want to forget about or don't want to have to deal with. So decks, most fire resistant decks are synthetic. You want to be able to clear the debris outside of your deck. That's again, a really low effort, low cost action item that can help a lot of people, especially when there's winds blowing embers under the on the underside of your property and your decks are open. So older, drier decks, have a higher chance of catching on fire. The area below where debris builds up acts as kindling for the fire, and so there's a couple different options here. So the first one is essentially this idea of closing up your deck. That's putting fencing below to reduce that vegetation buildup. That's also just something that a lot of people have done to stop animals from getting under your deck. And so it serves a lot of different purposes that can be used to essentially help homeowners understand the value. And again, more temporary and cost-effective mitigation can be spraying the deck with flame retardant, which again, if you're able to reduce the chances of an ember flying into your property and having to use that flame retardant, that's always the best bet. And so then, and we're getting to the end here, so I appreciate your patience and hope you're taking notes. If not, we have all of this for you at the end. But just to kind of start wrapping up here, then we go to wood piles and propane tanks. A lot of people that live in these areas, and this is something that we forget a lot of the time when we're in the insurance industry, is we're sourcing a lot of these quotes from a bunch of different places, like people that are in the woods and in the fields if they're on the coastline. And yes, their insurance policies are going to be higher, and we can make recommendations of them essentially making their house a concrete box in the forest. But at the end of the day, people that live in these areas because they love the nature, they love the aesthetic, they love having wood piles on their property. Like they want to have like a kindled fire at night, they want the warmth of the fire. So making it very clear that you understand where they're coming from and you understand why this is a benefit to them, why this is a place that they would want to live, is super, super important in connecting and communicating with your policyholder. That being said, wood piles are terrible for kindling near the property. So being able to communicate the value of covering them with a fire-resistant tarp or moving them far away from the home, typically NFPA guidelines are around at the 30-foot mark, is going to be really good for reducing the risk on your property. This also goes for wood stacked under the deck or along the siding, anywhere around that 0 to 5 foot, 0 to 30 foot in all reality area is going to be a lot more beneficial. And then propane tanks, this is relatively self-explanatory, but if a propane tank gets in contact with a fire and it's even relatively open for a second or the fire damages it, that's an explosion waiting to happen. So propane tanks should be around 30 feet from the property and surrounded by non-flammable materials so that the fire can't spread. So that's typically bare dirt, anywhere that doesn't have kind of like your typical area of vegetation or flammable material. And then with exterior structures and neighbors, this is always a touchy subject. Some neighbors are just going to be like that 80% that don't really understand what they need to do on their property, or simply don't want to because they live in this area and this is what they want to do. And so it's important to use these hardened management practices and use vegetation management to not only encourage people, but also, talk more about it and give better incentives. So defensible space is more effective when more people do it. So building that mitigation plan that includes neighbors is always a really effective strategy, as well as creating defensible space up until your neighbor's yard, not in your neighbor's yard, up until your neighbor's yard, to reduce that spread is going to be really beneficial. And I wanted to kind of end in terms of the general characteristics on the importance of Firewise councils. So for those of you who don't know about Firewise councils, they're essentially a nonprofit organization that helps people mitigate their risk and reduce their wildfire risk by offering statewide mitigation programs and creating fuel breaks, clearing evacuation routes for homeowners. It's generally a volunteer organization that Amanda and I have worked very personally with and really enjoy and love and think there need to be more resources out there. And so these councils can be a resource that a lot of people should utilize. For example, for Napa Firewise, where we worked, they offered green signs for wildfire suppression. And for those of you who don't know, if you have either a private wildfire fighting squadron or there's a home next to a wildfire, next to a firefighting station, these green signs make it extremely more likely that a firefighter is going to find that property, just because those green signs are going to be something that a lot of people can see through in the clouds of smoke. So I urge you to look into any local Firewise councils to learn a little bit more information about them. I'll put their link somewhere in our email after this, but this is a very important element of keeping more people involved and increasing that communication. All right, so this is essentially where we end. And I wanted to take a breather to end with these people. These people are people that were right after the Lahaina wildfire either contacted or were still surviving these really treacherous times. And these are the people at the end of the day we're trying to help. I think a lot of people forget that insurance allows us to be more comfortable, but it also allows us to be more resilient. We couldn't have webinars or like be in our homes or drive in our cars or anything like this if we weren't covered in one way or another. And it scares me to think about what life could be like without insurance. And it honestly should. It should scare everyone because insurance underlies everything we do, and our society is literally built around the foundation that insurance has provided us with. So bringing people value is about building something tangible, something that incentivizes them to do good, something that brings meaning into their lives. The people that we're helping are really impacted by natural disasters like these, and statistically, this is going to be half of the people in this room, or if not us, our families and loved ones. So we got into this to solve interesting problems with interesting people. And this work is interesting because people are interesting with their own lives and stories to tell. And they don't deserve to be stripped away by an ember that fell on their roof halfway out of winter. Bringing it back to this conversation of how do we use what's right in front of us. These people, policyholders, the people that care, these are our biggest motivating factor in everything we do. And it's really important to recognize that. So I hope I've convinced you that this is something to kind of take into account, but more importantly, that the people we're fighting for are worth the fight, and they're worth the education, communication, and value that we can bring them in this industry. We need to be focusing more on this as a whole, and I believe that we're on a mission to do that. So I wanted to thank everyone for listening in. I'll leave it open for any questions. I haven't checked the chat in a little bit, but yeah, thank you so much. I'll look in the chat. Yeah, Michael, absolutely. So when it comes to kind of like a fortified roof, whether the carrier can encourage the homeowner to fireproof their roof or their home by indicating a premium discount could be anticipated. IBHS is a fantastic organization. I think a lot of areas around that, around IBHS are utilizing their standards. The one thing that I want to urge people in IBHS and other carriers to consider is this idea that there's a lot of smaller steps that you can take on your property to reduce the risk, right? There's a lot of different steps that you can take that don't necessarily fit in with the bronze, silver, gold standard that IBHS puts on their fortified properties. And so for Wildfire, they basically have like a checklist that you can check off that includes all of these different areas of the home that you can mitigate, but you don't really qualify for any discount until you hit that checklist of items. And that's just an added barrier to people doing it. I know for myself and a lot of people I've talked to, it's kind of been this conversation of, oh, well, if I'm not getting anything for doing 3 out of the 5 items here, why would I do anything at all, right? So it's like aligning those incentives at, again, every step of the way and increasing policyholder engagement at those steps. That's really going to be where we make a lot of change. Yeah, and IBHS essentially has they have like a fortified home for, like you mentioned, Michael, in Alabama, but they also have like a wildfire, like an IBHS wildfire program. So the bronze, silver, gold that I mentioned before, that's something that they initiate. So yeah, I urge you to look into that. They're doing really good research and really good work. In terms of garage door protection, yeah, garage doors are kind of a nightmare when it comes to natural disasters. They have a lot of openings in them. They need to be properly reinforced. They also house your second most valuable asset in a lot of cases, which are your vehicles. And so for other natural disasters, it's relatively easy to say, yeah, just, for a hurricane, reinforce it with hurricane resistant garage doors, right? Like that's a pretty easy thing. But for wildfire, a lot of it is about sealing your garage and making sure there's very little, if not any, areas that you can basically see through. So if you close your garage door and you see that there's areas where an ember could potentially fly into, areas along the side of the garage door that aren't properly closed, or areas on the bottom that embers can fly into, that's going to be something that's really beneficial. As well as just the general garage door material and condition, right? If a garage door is made of vinyl, like your siding, or something that's, or maybe wood or something that's less flame resistant, that's going to be where a lot of those mishaps take place. So it's important to know what that material is, and whether there are any areas, at your disposal that you can kind of replace or reinforce that garage door. At the end of the day, if none of that is possible or not cost effective, flame retardant is always better than nothing. So there's a lot of good companies that can do a general spray and take care of a lot of that for you. Alrighty. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we are good to go. Thank you again for everyone kind of being here. This is again our second webinar. We'll be putting these on, probably once a quarter is kind of what we're aiming for. But we'll keep you in the loop. We have those again recorded, so we'll send to everything. But yeah, and feel free to reach out to us as well. We're Fora on everything. This is kind of something that you guys can look for. You can reach out to me at Valkyrie@fora.us, or Amanda@Fora.us. And so, yeah, no, thank you so much.